Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And continuing on with the Booker Longlist for 2023, I'm going to be talking about Ayobami Adebayo's A Spell of Good Things. And I will talk a little bit about some spoilers later. The first part will be spoiler-free and largely contained to the things that you'd know about from a description or a synopsis of the book. But I'll talk a little bit more about it anyhow, and feel free to log off if you need to before the spoiler bit. This is another book where I read it quite early in the year, and so as a result read it a little bit pre-Booker announcement. And the interesting thing about some of those things, when that happens, is how you then reappraise or appraise differently, I guess, books that you read before their announcements. And so there are some books where in the past I've read them after the announcement and it's made me think of them differently. So for example, reading Margaret Atwood's The Testaments after the win was one where I sort of maybe was harsher on the book because of the fact that it was then a winner. And something like A Spell of Good Things is a book that actually, I have to admit, when I read it pre-Booker, I knew it was eligible. I don't think I thought it was necessarily going to make the list. And increasingly, as I've been seeing people talk about the book since it was longlisted, I'm seeing a bit more why. I think I hadn't necessarily twigged some of the other parts that were going on in the book initially. And so now reappraising it through the lens of it having been longlisted has been quite an interesting experience of thinking, actually, what are the wider ramifications of some of what's done in the story? And so on that note, let's talk a little bit about the story of this book. So this book focuses on a set of characters in Nigeria, and particularly at the beginning of the book, we're focused on them as sort of younger people, so them as children, and how they interact with some of the various sort of machinations and sort of mechanics of sort of wider Nigerian society. So, for example, we have Wuraola, and she is this young girl with a lot of promise. She is often finding that there are these moments of tension with her parents because school fees are due. Her parents haven't always paid said school fees, and so she is sort of relegated to a lower position in school. She sort of understands quite early on almost that she is going to be looked down on in this school because she is one of the kids whose parents never seem to get it together to be able to pay. And we see a little bit of that through her eyes, but we also see a little bit of that through her parents' eyes, and recognise that in some occasions it is just that they don't have the money. And on other occasions, it is that they have misused that money, and therefore the kind of, again, the mechanics of the state almost act against her because it's a paid thing that she needs for schools, and despite her school's leniency, she is relegated further down because actually potentially there's somebody else who is higher priority, and that's often around the son in the family, Eniola. And he is an interesting figure in many ways as well, because he sees his role within the family as being partly to help support. So he sees a little bit about what's happening with his sister and the school fees, and he starts doing various things as well to support his family. So in this story, the father has lost his job. And what that means is that the family has this odd sense of, well, not odd, but this strong sense of how it kind of manages that financially within the family, but also how it manages that sort of reputational thing externally. So the shame of having lost the job really permeates so much of this. What then happens is this son starts to beg, and this sort of starts as a relatively small one-off thing. It's sort of presented in a relatively mundane way that he sort of does something here and there, and he starts to realize that he can maybe hustle to make a little bit of extra money. And one thing he starts doing is starting to beg out on the streets, and what that looks like is sort of increasingly ethically dubious as he starts taking on, let's say, almost characters that he is acting as in order to elicit sympathy to get money for for his family. And so there's this ethical consideration thrown up here of if you're doing an ethically wrong thing, but to serve, you know, a greater good in terms of protecting your family, ensuring that your sister might be able to go to school, all of those things, is it ethically okay? And equally, is that ethically okay also in a structural system of a kind of country where, as we find a little bit later in the book, parts of corruption are kind of, you know, come up regularly. And where that particularly comes up is a character around politics. And this, without going into a great deal of spoilers here, is where this kind of comes into a broader conversation. Eniola is seen as this potentially, well, because of his almost dishonesty in being this sort of beggar character, him sort of lying about who he is in that sense, he is someone who is seen as potentially then being of great service to a politician, in what's quite a fun bit of satire in any country in the world. And what that starts to poke at as well is what people will do to gain power or to look after their families. And I think this is the part of the book that maybe I didn't think about too much when I read it initially, that was sort of what that says more broadly about society. I kind of knew that was there, but I didn't necessarily think about that on a deeper level. And I think actually what's quite interesting here is how the book then develops that as a conversation around, if you've got these sort of corrupt politicians who will quite happily do things like this and what have you, what does that mean for people who are surviving within that system? What does it mean for them acting unethically in order to serve this greater good? And with that, let's go into some light spoilers. It's not a great amount spoiler-wise, because I think I've kind of covered a lot of the parts I wanted to say here anyway. But before I go into the spoiler bit anyway, I just want to say, actually, I think overall this is a very interesting family drama of a book. I enjoyed it a lot. Even if I think at first I maybe didn't sort of appraise it in a sort of necessarily a deep way. I think I just sort of listened to the story, moved on with my life. But I think actually where it does bring up some interesting conversation is particularly around sort of disparities within society, and what that then looks like if you are one of the people who is in the lower bracket of that, who is not getting by particularly well. And I think the writing serves that in quite an interesting way as being this sort of accessible family drama kind of format, but with some deeper levels in it, I think. And with that, let's go into some of the spoilers, and feel free to log off if you need to here. So going into some spoilers, I mentioned about this begging and the sort of unethical elements of it. And I think what's particularly key here is what that then starts to look like. So this is not just begging in a simple sense. This is Eniola pretending to be blind, for example, or pretending to have various learning difficulties, or all host of other things, which is so ethically wrong, and he's called out by several characters for it. But he is trying to find ways of doing this. And this is all against the backdrop where, for him, this is a perfectly legitimate route. He kind of knows it's a bit wrong, but he also is sort of wondering what other options he has. Tied to that is also that people around him are frustrated at what he's doing. And he does understand that. He does sort of seem to get that, but he is very much trying to understand where he belongs within that. And particularly then where politics gets quite complicated, and I mentioned that he's sort of taken under the wing of a politician, he then, as a result, is sort of party to a great deal of violence and to a great deal of disruption. That violence has massive ramifications through his world and through the worlds of many others, but in a way that I think also plays off something that's a bit more uniquely Nigerian, potentially, of this book. So I was trying to imagine, when thinking about these themes, about what this might look like in a more British context, and a lot of this could very neatly apply. But what I think is particularly interesting here is the way that Adebayo uses the sort of local ties around how families perceive of kinship and various other things, to sort of look at then where this violence leads. So actually, characters are interconnected in a much sort of richer tapestry than might necessarily be in a sort of British novel that told the same story. By which I mean that the sort of, there's a lot of the kind of, oh, this person's my aunt's friend's relative, like these kinds of really broad social networks that in many ways in the book allow for a greater deal of empathy, that characters really support and look after each other. And part of this is, I'm doing this to look after this person to do this and blah, blah, blah. But where this then also kind of causes things is around the corruption within politics, where we are also seeing the negative flip side of this, where the politician is allowed to run rampant at one point by exploiting not only those same social networks, but also the fears of people in an external social network. So he is able to position himself as being this sort of great man who's going to make everything right for people, whilst sort of to a reader, he is clearly evidence, and he's clearly sort of benefited from that corruption himself. He is the corrupt politician that he's calling out as being the reason for everyone's ills. And this happens all the time in politics everywhere, right? That somebody says, well, actually, the reason that you don't have a job or whatever is this group of people, and here's what I'm going to do to make it right. And so I think there's a sort of a wider piece of satire and sort of political sort of statement being made within the book about how politics is so often a way of the most vulnerable being set off against each other, or being made to do things that are unethical, such as the way Eniola begs and sort of takes on the kind of characters of people who are blind or who have various learning difficulties in order to make ends meet for his family. And all of that kind of creates this patchwork where everybody's kind of just hustling to do what they need to. Meanwhile, there's this sort of political class who are doing incredibly well. And so I think this is sort of quite a fun way of poking at that sort of complex political situation internally that I think was very well done in the book, and maybe something that I don't think I'd appreciated the first time when I read this book, and then the first time I was sort of thinking about it and reviewing it. So I think overall this book is a really interesting one, and I see increasingly why it's made it onto the list and why it's made it into some people's top books from that list as well. It's not necessarily right up there for me in terms of all of the books on the long list, but I think I'm coming to reappraise it in a way that I find quite interesting now, as opposed to what I was thinking about it before. Anyway, I've been Bob the Booker talking about this book. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please, if you can, avoid spoilers in the comments. But if not, either way, I've been Bob talking about this book, and I hope you're doing really well. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.